Good morning and welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for the introduction and also for the invitation. I will start today's event with the presentation on the clinical trial regulation with an introduction and an overview with focus on the situation in Switzerland. After a few words on Interpharma, I will then focus on the clinical trial regulation. Starting with an overview, I will guide you through the goals and the timelines first. Then I will focus on the impact on Switzerland and provide also some industry perspectives. Interpharma is the Swiss Association of research-based pharmaceutical companies. So Interpharma represents almost the entire innovative market and half of the off-patent market with generic competition in Switzerland. The Interpharma members contribute significantly to innovation and quality of life for the Swiss population. It is our vision that Switzerland remains the leading pharma hub with high-quality medical innovation. Optimum framework conditions in Switzerland will remain essential for a successful and internationally competitive pharmaceutical hub. You might have seen in the last weeks posters of our national campaign at train stations, for example, or around in the cities. This campaign shall increase the public awareness of the importance of research and innovation and also the contribution of Interpharma member companies to it. So if you're interested, please have a look. Coming now to the EU clinical trial regulation. The EU clinical trial regulation will come into application in a few days on January 31st. Also into effect will come the recently published Implementing Act on Safety. The EU clinical trial regulation replaces the clinical trial directive and harmonizes the clinical trials management in the European Union. The CTIS, the Clinical Trials Information System, is the centralized EU portal and database, and therefore the integral tool of the EU CTR. The European Medicines Agency sets up and maintains CTIS in collaboration with the EU member states and the European Commission. Some background on the history to come to the time point where we stand now. So the EU CTR entered into force in June 2014, so quite a long time ago. However, the applicability of the EU CTR is linked to a fully functional electronic portal and database. Based on the regulation, the full functionality needs to be verified by the European Medicines Agency on the basis of an independent audit. And after some delays, this audit of the system was initiated in December 2020. On the basis of the audit results, the EMA Management Board was able to confirm then in April last year that the EU portal and database are fully functional. And in July 2021, with the publication of the Commission notice, the date of the applicability was fixed and set to the 31st of January 2022. With a short comparison between the directive and the regulation, the key changes are visible. While the directive is a guidance with national interpretation, the regulation is binding and directly applicable in all EU member states. With the directive, there was an independent submission of the trial applications to the different EU member states, which is under the regulation now changed, to one single submission via one single tool. This leads then to a simultaneous approval and enrollment in the EU member states. What are the goals of the clinical trial regulation? The aim of the European Commission with the implementation of the EU CTR is addressing three key points. It aims to provide a favorable environment for clinical trials in the EU, having the highest standards of safety for trial participants, and providing an increased transparency of trial information. This goal shall be achieved with consistent rules throughout the EU and public availability of information on clinical trials. The benefits from an EU perspective are based on four key factors: the harmonized processes, the collaboration between the member states, the increased transparency on trial information, and the highest safety standards. With that, an increased efficiency is planned to be achieved, especially for trials in multi-member states, as well as to avoid unnecessary duplication and repetition of unsuccessful trials. Some short words about the CTIS. The Clinical Trial Information System is the core tool of the regulation and will provide lifecycle support for a clinical trial, with monitoring tools and document management capabilities. There are different workspaces for sponsors, authorities, and also for the public. Looking at the transition timelines, there are two transition periods to be pointed out. In the first year after the implementation, there is still a choice for initial clinical trial application. After that first year, with transition period 2, it will then be mandatory to submit all new clinical trial applications under the clinical trial regulation. However, ongoing trials can continue under the directive until implementation date plus 3 years. This means that February 2025 is the final deadline for full transition of all ongoing clinical trials. The clinical trial regulation is applicable in the EU, but what is the impact on Switzerland? What applies for clinical trials conducted outside the EU? The EU Commission states here that clinical trials conducted outside the EU but submitted for marketing authorization in the EU have to follow similar principles as outlined in the directive relating to medicinal products for human use, and should also be conducted in accordance with principles that are equivalent to those of the regulation, as regards to the rights and safety of the subject and the reliability and robustness of the data generated in the clinical trial. The data submitted has to be registered in a public register, which is a data provider to the WHO database. The implications for Switzerland have been assessed in a multidisciplinary study commissioned by the Federal Office of Public Health. I'm making reference to that here. You can also see the link to find the study. There are two key areas where differences and therefore also possible implications are identified. the right and the safety of the subject, and the transparency, reliability, and robustness of the data. With regards to right and safety of the subject, we can state the following or find the following differences. For the duty of information, there is higher requirement with regards to vulnerable population. Under Swiss law, it is not the maturity, but the state of capacity, so the ability to understand information that determines whether an individual is authorized to give informed consent. As a mitigation, a deputyship could be established. Secondly, there are more stringent EU data protection requirements, which as a mitigation could be adapted. In addition, there are also differences in the composition requirements for ethics committees. So the question is the acceptance of the formal equivalence, or the formal acceptance of the equivalence. Differences could potentially be assessed in audits performed by the EU authorities to confirm this equivalence. In case of clinical trials performed in Switzerland as part of a multi-center trial led by an EU-based sponsor, the Swiss data, including master file, is to be entered in the EU database. Trials conducted in Switzerland under the same protocol, but organizationally separate, the fulfillment of the EU requirement is needed on information compilation and availability. Also important to mention that the Swiss database, BASEC and CTIS are separate databases and are not linked. As a key takeout, we can say there is an indirect impact of the EU CTR for trials in Switzerland if they are part of international multi-center trials. Some requirements are more stringent. However, there are no conflicts of law. Marketing authorization in the European Union, which is based on Swiss studies, is dependent on the recognition of equivalence. Compliance with the Swiss Human Research Act is not always fully sufficient. However, company standards are also based on ICH and EU requirements. Now, a few words on the industry perspective. As we have seen, there are differences, but are these differences necessarily disadvantages, or could they also be advantages for Switzerland? Looking into different aspects like applicability, the process, and the tools, we can assess the differences. The Swiss Human Research Act has a broad applicability and covers research on human diseases and the structure and functionality of the human body. And it covers clinical trials also beyond medicinal products. In comparison, the EU CTR is limited to development of medicinal products and excludes combination products. The process in Switzerland is relatively lean, with one authority and different ethic committees. The lean processes are short, with short timeframes are key and should be even further improved. However, also Swiss finishes should be avoided. Looking at the EU CTR, it may lead to complex collaboration and alignment among member states. The ethic commission processes remain in the member states. There are also different databases. Time and experience will show how complex the CTIS portal is and what will be the comparison to the Swiss portals. It should be the goal to have an electronic submission portal for Switzerland also implemented as soon as possible. So in conclusion, and with that also coming to the end of the presentation, then we can say, make use of the advantages. Take advantage of the experience and also the expertise as well as the flexibility on the Swiss environment. As a small country, we have lean processes and tight stakeholder collaboration. The strengths of the current legislation should be kept. Here, there is the advantage of the short timeframes. The timeframes should be kept and even further improved to be as efficient as possible and make an advantage out of it. The option of a fast track approach for high medical need is also required from an industry perspective and would provide a significant benefit compared to the EU CTR. Also, the broad scope of the Human Research Act should be kept. Not to forget that we can build on the expertise of researchers and the quality of trial execution. This is where we can take advantage of. With this, I'm concluding with the presentation, maybe also with a quick reference to the sources which I have used or which we have used. And yeah, I would like to thank you very much for your interest and also for your attention.